The world has yet to recover from the shock of Ozzy Osbourne's passing, the indomitable Prince of Darkness, at the age of 76, just 17 days after performing a farewell concert with Black Sabbath titled Back to the Beginning at Villa Park in his hometown of Birmingham. But few know that only hours later, Sharon Osbourne unexpectedly appeared with a statement that shook the art and media world, leaving fans even more stunned. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video as a gesture of tribute and remembrance for the legendary Ozzy Osbourne. It wasn't the end he sang about in his songs. It wasn't thunder or fanfare. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that creeps in when a storm has passed, and all that's left is the wreckage of what once roared. On the morning of July 22, 2025, in his home nestled deep within Buckinghamshire, Ozzy Osbourne, the unbreakable Prince of Darkness, exhaled one final time. But this was no surrender. This was choice. This was control. This was the last act of a man who had spent his entire life dancing with chaos, only to greet death with order. The official cause: respiratory failure due to complications from late-stage Parkinson's disease. But for those who knew him, who loved him, who feared and revered him, it wasn't a medical diagnosis that took Ozzy Osbourne. It was time, brutal and inevitable. Ozzy was born with the PARK2 gene, a rare mutation that carries the least aggressive form of Parkinson's. For years, Sharon had clung to that scientific sliver of hope. But it wasn't enough. The disease crept in like a thief, robbing him first of motion, then of music, and finally of voice. By early July, he was no longer speaking. Communication came only through subtle flickers of his eyes and the faintest curve of his lips. But he was present, fully, terribly, heartbreakingly present. His family confirmed the news through an official press release, signed in full by Sharon Osbourne and their 3 children, Amy, Kelly, and Jack. The statement was short, controlled, restrained, just as Ozzy had asked. There would be no circus, no headlines spun for drama. There would only be truth and love. In her first private interview following the announcement, Sharon Osbourne said, "We were prepared for this. Ozzy didn't want machines. He didn't want hospitals. He wanted to die in the house where he raised his children, where he wrote his songs, where he laughed the loudest and cried the hardest. He wanted to leave as he lived, in defiance of fear, surrounded by those who mattered, and on his own absolute terms." That choice had been made months earlier, after his final hospitalization in spring 2025. Quietly, under Sharon's direction, their home was transformed into a round-the-clock medical sanctuary. A specialized care team was hand-picked and brought in. Nurses rotated on silent shifts. Machines were kept to a minimum. Ozzy didn't want to sound like a hospital. He wanted to sound like home, and that's what Sharon gave him. Internal meetings began in early July, involving legal advisors, doctors, and close family members. Everything was documented, every preference, every refusal. Sharon wouldn't let him be reduced to a patient. He was still Ozzy, still a husband, still a father, still an unshakable legend. The only thing different now was the volume. Turned down, but never off. 3 days before his death, a final video call was arranged. Ozzy, lying still, his breath labored but his gaze sharp, stared into the screens that connected him to Amy, Jack, and Kelly. He couldn't speak. He didn't need to. In a moment described later by Jack as devastatingly clear, each child understood what their father was saying. "Goodbye. I love you. Don't be afraid." Only one person was asked to be by his side in his final hours: Sharon. In the personal letter she released to accompany the death announcement, she wrote, "He and I kept our old promises. No transfers, no strangers, no final scenes written by someone else. Everything was exactly how he wanted." Ozzy Osbourne died in the early hours, fully conscious, his breathing shallow, but his mind lucid. His final moments were not punctuated by words, but by presence. He held Sharon's hand. She kissed his forehead. She whispered a lyric he once wrote when he was 24. "I'm going through changes." For 12 hours, his body remained untouched, wrapped in silence and candlelight in a private room. No press, no photos, no intrusion, just stillness. His body was later transported by a private funeral service, prearranged months in advance, to a burial plot he had selected years ago. The inscription had already been chosen. He screamed so we could be heard. His was not a death of tragedy, but of defiance, of orchestration, of love carried to its painful, final crescendo. The Prince of Darkness didn't vanish. He departed with intention, surrounded by the only people who had ever truly seen the man beneath the myth. It was, as Sharon later said, the most difficult mercy I've ever had to give. And yet, through every echo of sorrow, every breathless silence, his music plays on. And through it, he is still here. In the quiet days of early July, while the world remained unaware of what was unfolding behind the closed doors of the Osbourne estate, the family began holding a series of internal meetings that would ultimately lead to one of the most emotionally wrenching farewells in music history. It wasn't just about planning for Ozzy Osbourne's final hours. It was about preserving his dignity, his wishes, and his deeply personal understanding of what it meant to die on one's own terms. With every detail meticulously organized by Sharon Osbourne, what followed was a display of love not loud, but unwavering. Sharon refused any form of media interference for the 72 hours leading up to the announcement, sealing the house from any outside intrusion. No reporters, no speculation, just silence and the sacred duty of saying goodbye. Information was controlled with absolute precision, passed only through the Osbourne family's legal team. This was not about public relations or legacy crafting. It was about shielding the final hours of a man who had given so much of himself to the public, yet now asked for nothing but peace. Even his final conversations with the children were stripped of dramatics. A video call was arranged 3 days before his passing. What would be the last time they would see their father alive? Ozzy could no longer speak. The Parkinsonian symptoms had robbed him of his voice, but not his essence. Through subtle movements, flickers in his eyes, the tightening of a brow, he communicated what needed to be said. No confusion, no ambiguity, only understanding. The kind of understanding that only decades of shared pain and love can build. Jack Osbourne would later share, "We understood what he was trying to say." It wasn't a question of words, it was a matter of knowing him. That final connection, unspoken but soul-deep, became the family's private goodbye. It was not captured on camera. It was not recorded. It wasn't for the world. It was theirs, and theirs alone. In that moment, the absence of sound became louder than any scream. It was a farewell delivered through stillness, a goodbye wrapped in eye contact. Sharon's role was never more apparent than during those hours. Not as a manager, not as a media figure, but as a wife, a protector, a guardian of the one man who trusted her to carry out his last wish with complete fidelity. It's a haunting image. The Prince of Darkness, once screaming into sold-out stadiums, now reduced to glances and breath. Yet somehow it's also the most powerful expression of love the world never got to see. And maybe that's the point. Not every ending needs to be public. Some are so sacred, they demand silence. As Sharon shielded Ozzy from the media, the family cocooned him in dignity. A silence more profound than applause. A goodbye more eternal than words. This was not a deathbed spectacle. It was a final act of rebellion, orchestrated not on stage, but in quiet rooms filled with knowing hearts. In this space of controlled chaos and silent grief, Ozzy's true legacy, his humanity, was laid bare. It's almost unbearable to imagine. A man who once defied death on stage 100 times, now surrendering to it in peaceful silence, surrounded only by love and intention. But for those who knew Ozzy, who really knew him, this was always how it would end. Not in the noise, but in the depth of connection that transcended all things. It was goodbye, but it was also love in its most distilled, agonizingly beautiful form. Sharon Osbourne had always stood at Ozzy's side through the firestorms of fame, scandal, and sickness, but nothing could prepare the world for the gravity of her final letter. When she stepped forward and released her private statement, it was not to dramatize, not to grieve aloud, but to honor a vow made long ago in quiet solidarity. There was no intervention, she wrote, no machines, no hospital transfers. Nothing was done outside of Ozzy's wishes. Those words echoed like a final shield of dignity, protecting a man who had lived his entire life in the harsh glare of the spotlight. Ozzy Osbourne died fully conscious, fully aware, his mind still flickering with the force that had once shaken stadiums. In a world where death is often sanitized, clinical, and distanced, his was starkly human, intimate, conscious, and brave. Sharon made sure of that. There were no emergency sirens, no sterile hospital walls. Only the scent of familiar rooms, the presence of his children, and the quiet strength of a woman who had guided him through every storm. His body was not whisked away or buried under the eyes of cameras. It was kept in a private room for 12 hours, the silence broken only by the whispers of close family and the distant pulse of a life now past. There were no live streams, no media vans, no flashbulbs, just the stillness of goodbye, observed in sacred privacy. Even the funeral was hidden from the world, not out of secrecy, but reverence. The burial was carried out quietly at the Osbourne family plot, exactly where Ozzy had said he wished to rest, surrounded by the people who had seen every side of him, the legend and the man. Sharon had composed every element of the farewell herself, down to the final detail. The music that played, not chart toppers or greatest hits, but an unreleased version of "See You on the Other Side," remixed per Ozzy's final request. It was the ultimate expression of agency in death. A final song chosen by the man who had always refused to be silenced. In her silence, in her restraint, she honored not just a husband, but a warrior who had battled his demons, his body, and the world, and had chosen to end his journey not in a blaze of publicity, but in the steadiness of love. Ozzy didn't want spectacle. He wanted peace. Sharon delivered that peace, not just as his wife, but as his final guardian. In that choice, and in the letter she left behind, Sharon preserved the most sacred truth of all. Ozzy died the way he lived, on his own terms, unfiltered and unbroken. And for those who have ever loved and lost, there is something hauntingly beautiful about that kind of ending. It tells us that dignity is not in the absence of death, but in the presence of intention. Her letter will not be displayed in museums or quoted in news cycles endlessly. It will live in the minds of those who understood Ozzy's fight, not just with fame or addiction or disease, but with the very idea of surrender. Sharon's quiet prose, written in the language of devotion, will remain etched in memory as the final chapter of a love story that defied the world. A goodbye with no spectacle, just soul. The most haunting chapter of Ozzy Osbourne's farewell was written not with headlines or public tributes, but with silence, guarded, intentional, sacred. The funeral, planned in excruciating detail by Sharon Osbourne herself, was not simply an event. It was a final performance, private, stripped of cameras, stripped of spectacle, and lit only by memory and music. Every word, every note, every step was a manifestation of Ozzy's final wishes, a ceremony of intimacy. The program? Never made public. The guest list? Limited to only those who had carried pieces of his soul for decades. Even the location remained hidden, known only as a quiet corner of the Osbourne family plot. For 12 hours, his body was kept in a separate room, untouched by the world, as if time itself was asked to pause and bow in respect. And then came the music. Not hits, not classics, but unreleased, unshared recordings. Songs Ozzy had created during his recovery from the 2019 accident. They weren't meant for charts. They weren't meant for fame. They were made for this moment, for his family, for his final curtain call. At the climax of the ceremony, the speakers trembled with the sound of "See You on the Other Side." Not the version fans had known for decades, but a reimagined remix he had personally requested in 2023. That track, imbued with the weight of knowing, carried his breath, his pain, his gratitude. It wasn't just a song, it was a whisper through the veil. I remember you. I forgive you. I love you. Goodbye. Those present didn't clap. They cried. They held hands. They looked at the floor, at the sky, at each other, searching for something to hold on to now that the man who had screamed their pain into anthems was gone. There were no eulogies, no preachers, no proclamations, just the music, just Ozzy. In the end, it was fitting. For a man who had always let his art speak louder than his words, this was the most honest farewell imaginable. And those songs? They remain unreleased, untouched, and unheard by the world, locked away, protected. Because, as Sharon put it, they weren't for charts. They were for closure. In this most sacred moment, Ozzy Osbourne gave his final performance not to millions, but to the few who knew his silence better than his screams. And in doing so, he reminded the world that the truest goodbyes are never loud. They're lived. This was not just a funeral. It was a vow, a bridge between this life and the next, scored by the only thing powerful enough to hold a soul, a song. But before this final act of love and music could be written, their story was nearly undone by betrayal, by heartbreak, and by the crumbling weight of decades lived under a spotlight. In 2016, the world was shaken not just by Ozzy Osbourne's declining health, but by a scandal that nearly shattered the foundation of his 40-year marriage. News of an extramarital affair surfaced, and for the first time in decades, Sharon Osbourne walked away. It wasn't just a separation, it was the collapse of a sacred partnership that had weathered fame, addiction, and the harshest storms of celebrity life. Sharon called it a breakdown of trust. She stripped Ozzy of his performance privileges, froze all media appearances, and demanded a complete reevaluation of his role, not just as a public figure, but as a husband, a father, and a man. What followed wasn't a quiet reconciliation. It was a systematic restructuring. Under Sharon's direction, a comprehensive system was put in place. Legal contracts, media embargoes, financial oversight, and psychological treatment, all designed to hold Ozzy accountable and rebuild what had been broken. He voluntarily entered a specialized treatment center aimed at controlling impulses and re-establishing emotional boundaries. This wasn't about image repair, it was about saving a life and saving a marriage. Their children, Jack, Kelly, and Amy, became the glue. Jack took on the task of protecting his father's privacy in public settings. Kelly helped control the family's media footprint, shaping narratives that respected Ozzy's vulnerability without feeding the tabloids. Amy remained the quiet compass, stepping in only when needed, ensuring emotional balance in a time of chaos. Out of this crucible came not just a reunited couple, but a new architecture of family. Sharon no longer operated simply as Ozzy's wife. She became his conservator, his manager, and the architect of his final years. Every move, every decision, every interview or canceled tour went through a protocol, meticulously documented and legally binding. What emerged was not a love story in the traditional sense, but something deeper, a bond reforged in fire and sealed with discipline, loyalty, and a relentless pursuit of dignity. In later interviews, Sharon admitted, "We didn't get back together because we forgot what happened. We got back together because we remembered who we were before it all fell apart." This was not a fairy tale. It was survival. It was structure. It was the final, unbreakable act of devotion between two people who had seen the darkest sides of each other and chose, still, to build a way forward. Sharon Osbourne didn't just forgive. She rebuilt Ozzy's world brick by brick. And in doing so, she secured the legacy of a man too wild to be tamed, but never too far gone to be saved. She wasn't just his wife. She was his manager, his gatekeeper, his protector, his architect, the woman who curated every second of Ozzy Osbourne's public existence and shielded him from its aftermath. In the years following their marital crisis, Sharon Osbourne quietly assumed an even more expansive role: total control. From the music studio to the hospital bed, from contract negotiations to his children's Instagram posts, nothing escaped her purview. Every piece of Ozzy's world was meticulously structured. Sharon established a multi-layered legal network that controlled his touring company, intellectual property rights, image licensing, and financial oversight. Long before his final days, she had already reorganized the entire Osbourne enterprise into a fortress. No music was released without her consent. No performance, appearance, or partnership went forward without her signature. Even reality show scripts, promotional captions, and collaborations were funneled through her media department. Sharon wasn't simply involved. She was the final authority. Behind the scenes, she assumed roles that would exhaust an army. She oversaw his diet, medication schedule, insurance negotiations, and recovery logistics. She appointed personal advisors for each family member to ensure consistency and protection. Ozzy's life was no longer spontaneous. It became a high-functioning support structure. One staff member recalled, every hour of his day was scheduled to the minute, and Sharon approved every hour. Their children were integrated into this matrix. Kelly managed social media communications under Sharon's guidance. Jack handled privacy protection and legal coordination. Amy remained a neutral party, only stepping in when requested. Everything from educational pathways to press releases was handled with precision and control. Financially, Sharon enacted a tiered system. Annual budgets were projected based on Ozzy's medical condition and performance goals, with reserve funds allocated for health emergencies. Royalties, licensing deals, and merchandise profits were funneled through 3 distinct corporate layers, all under Sharon's authority. This not only ensured fiscal responsibility, but insulated Ozzy from the volatility of fame and market swings. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of her control was in the realm of image. Ozzy Osbourne, forever the Prince of Darkness, the madman on stage, was, in truth, a carefully sustained persona. Every interview, every moment of vulnerability, every on-stage stumble or defiant shout was processed through Sharon's lens. She understood the myth, and she protected it ferociously. This wasn't about vanity or control for its own sake. It was about legacy. She was curating how the world would remember him, not just as a performer, but as a man who had suffered, risen, fallen, and ultimately endured. In doing so, Sharon became the unseen hand behind every resurrection Ozzy experienced, the strategist who transformed pain into power, scandal into story, chaos into coherence. In the final years of Ozzy's life, Sharon Osbourne was more than a manager. She was his system. And in the absence of his voice, hers was the only one that mattered. In the eyes of those who watched from afar, Sharon was demanding. But in truth, she was devoted. Tirelessly, relentlessly, and without applause. And in a world where chaos reigned, she built order. For love. In the final years of Ozzy's life, Sharon Osbourne was more than a manager. She was his system, and in the absence of his voice, hers was the only one that mattered. By the time his condition reached its most fragile point, Sharon had already set into motion one of the most sophisticated end-of-life medical support systems ever constructed for a private individual. She contracted 3 specialized medical teams, neurological, motor function, and symptom management, to operate on a 24/7 rotation within their primary residence. This was no standard palliative care. It was a command center, customized down to the frequency of room lighting and the calibration of every monitor. For Ozzy to appear in public during this time, he had to meet 3 strict criteria: the ability to sit upright without assistance, the capacity for coherent speech, and partial control of facial expressions. These weren't just medical benchmarks, they were safeguards of dignity. Sharon ensured the world never saw him reduced, never remembered him in weakness. If he was seen, it was on his terms, through her lens. All medical data, from oxygen saturation logs to neuromuscular diagnostics, was encrypted and stored in a private archive. Weekly updates were reviewed by a legal and medical advisory board, all bound by rigorous confidentiality agreements. Sharon's management was relentless, but it was also compassionate. Her goal wasn't to prolong his suffering, it was to prolong his clarity, his agency, and the sovereignty of his legacy. As Ozzy's disease progressed and autonomy diminished, even the smallest decisions, what he wore, what music played in the room, were made with care. Sharon preserved his preferences to the end. She requested that the television be kept off during his most disoriented hours, that only vinyl records be played in the evenings, and that his room always be filled with the scent of patchouli, his favorite since the 70s. This orchestration wasn't about denial, it was about honor. Honor in how he was seen. Honor in how he exited. Sharon once said to a close friend, "He built his life on chaos. I built mine on structure." In the end, he needed both. And so Ozzy Osbourne, the loudest, wildest, most chaotic force in rock history, spent his final days in stillness, watched over by the woman who had transformed noise into legacy, and rebellion into reverence. In the final chapter of Ozzy Osbourne's extraordinary journey, the handling of his will, estate, and legacy became a reflection of the same fierce autonomy and deeply personal vision that defined his life. Sharon Osbourne, as expected, assumed full and undisputed control over all of Ozzy's personal and artistic assets. There were no legal challenges, no family disputes, only clarity, order, and a firm hand guiding the Osbourne empire into its next phase. Each of their 3 children received a distinct role in the preservation of their father's legacy. Kelly Osbourne was entrusted with media consultation, helping shape how Ozzy's image would continue to live in the public eye. Jack Osbourne took charge of supervising digital assets and overseeing legal protections related to Ozzy's intellectual property. Amy Osbourne, the most private of the 3, was given stewardship over unreleased non-commercial music recordings, many of which held immense personal value. Notably, Sharon made a decisive choice that stunned some observers. She refused to establish a public foundation, museum, or memorial organization in Ozzy's name. Her reason was simple, yet resolute: to preserve full control over every element of his image, voice, and identity. Every tribute, every retrospective, every use of Ozzy's name would remain under the careful eye of the person who had managed him for decades, his wife, his protector, his fiercest advocate. Unreleased musical works, including songs written during Ozzy's recovery periods, remain in Sharon's custody. These recordings, deeply intimate and often raw, are now part of a vault that only she can open. No announcements have been made about their future use, keeping fans around the world in suspense. What becomes of these hidden treasures will be a decision weighed with time, intention, and deep respect. Though Sharon declined public organizational commemorations, she allowed one global event to honor Ozzy's legacy on a massive scale. In one of the most powerful tributes yet to Ozzy's legacy, a massive global farewell concert titled Back to the Beginning. Ozzy's final bow was organized. Its aim not just to honor a music legend, but to do good in his name. The event successfully raised over £140 million, approximately 190 to 200 million US dollars, for causes close to Ozzy's heart, including Parkinson's research, the Birmingham Children's Hospital, and Acorns Children's Hospice. It was streamed worldwide via pay-per-view and will be immortalized as a feature-length documentary scheduled for release in 2026. Financial records at the time of Ozzy's passing estimate his total net worth to be in the range of 220 million US dollars, consisting of a diverse portfolio including real estate properties in Buckinghamshire and Los Angeles, shares in touring companies, royalties from decades of music licensing, and personal brand equity. These assets are now protected within a multi-layered legal structure created and managed by Sharon, ensuring that his estate remains secure, centralized, and aligned with the artistic principles Ozzy lived by. In this way, Ozzy's final farewell wasn't just about music. It was about meaning, mission, and the uncompromising integrity with which he and Sharon shaped every step of his life and every beat of his goodbye. It wasn't just a legacy preserved. It was a goodbye conducted with purpose, discipline, and eternal love. And now, as the lights dim and the world learns to live in the silence his absence leaves behind, we remember him not only for the noise he made on stage, but for the soul he shared with us off it. Ozzy Osbourne didn't just defy the odds, he redefined what it meant to fight, to endure, and to love through the storm. His life was a thunderous ballad of rebellion and redemption. And behind that enduring voice stood Sharon Osbourne, a woman of steel and soul whose boundless love, quiet resilience, and unmatched loyalty carried them both through heartbreak, scandal, illness, and the long night of goodbye. Her forgiveness after betrayal, her strength through disease, and her unwavering protection of the man behind the myth make her not only a wife, but a timeless symbol of grace under fire. May Ozzy find the peace he long searched for, and may Sharon and their family find healing in the unshakable truth that his spirit lives on, not just in memory, but in every song, every silence, and every heart he ever touched. We bid farewell not only to a legend, but to a love story forged in fire and held together by a woman who never gave up. Rest in power, Ozzy. May your music echo through eternity, and may your family carry forward your spirit with strength and serenity. If you've been touched by this story, we invite you to honor Ozzy's legacy by liking, sharing, and subscribing. It's more than a gesture, it's a promise that we will never forget.